Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back. It's Marie with Swipe in the City, here with Michelle.
Here, recording on a Thursday. We should be on dates tonight. What are we doing? We're dating each other this week.
I know, right? I feel like we need to stop saying like what day it is too, even though it totally impacts like what we're even thinking in our brains because these are going to come out whenever.
Well, right. I mean, they always come out on Wednesday, but I do feel like it's a
Right.
little bit of a disclaimer. Like, I still have like DocuSign open on my computer. I've still got like a presentation to edit tonight. I'm still in work mode a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, really excited about the topic tonight. I feel like over the last few months, we've been digging in a bit more to um, toxicity and mental health and digging more into like those topics along with our usual silly fun ones. um,
Bullshit.
do you want to maybe describe the idea for tonight's episode?
Yeah. So a few weeks ago, we had Mike the producer on, and we were talking about toxicity in relationships. And so if y'all haven't listened to that, go back. I don't remember exactly how long ago it was, but obviously Michelle, Mike, and I are not experts. And especially when we're talking about something like toxicity and toxicity versus abuse, um, we felt like it was kind of important to bring somebody on who might have a little bit more insight and professional experience than we do. So we brought my stepdad, Marc, back for another Ask a Therapist session. And yeah, I'm super excited.
Me too. I feel like we've got some really good questions to cover, and I can't wait to kind of just hear how his actual professional answers compare against some of the things that we feel and or just made up.
Yeah. I'm excited to actually like almost maybe like listen to them back to back would be kind of funny. Um, yeah, and I mean, honestly, he loves these too. Um, so I think he's excited to come on.
Awesome.
And we're back. Welcome. Did you just burp?
No, it said this session is being recorded.
It's a new Zoom feature. We're not quite sure why, but it does it on every single call and every time you turn recording on and off.
It's so annoying, but what
They
an
want
intro,
to they
Mark.
want people to not be taken by surprise and
And
mention
then,
somebody's name in a certain illegal activity or something like that. All
to
right.
make
Well,
you look good.
welcome back, Mark. It is good to see you again. I like this. You've got an orange shirt on for those who can't see. It's a great color for that Florida tan. How are you doing?
Well, it's not that I go out sunning. I stay out of the sun as much as I can. But I'm fine. I'm glad to see you. And not too long ago, I saw Marie.
I know that was fun. And in not too long, you'll see me again. You're gonna get
Yep.
sick of me this summer.
Yep. Yeah,
Can't wait.
already. I'm already had my fill.
I know. Yeah, I guess we don't need to go to Vegas, huh?
Sure.
Just send mom by herself.
Oh, God.
Well, Mark, you want to give a quick intro for those who have not met you yet on the show?
I'm an old guy. I'm a, I'm a retired psychologist. Um, I have a lot of experience with drug and alcohol abuse, but in general, I've had a private practice and also in a practice with psychiatric groups. So I've got a smattering of everything, marital, family, individual, um, types of cases you've never heard of or imagined of, and I've run across them and dealt with them. Um, that's about does it.
Old guy, lots of experience. There you go.
Yep.
We brought in our expert who knows more about toxicity than we do. Michelle, want to start us off?
Yeah. So the first question we kind of wanted to define in a previous episode, Marie and I took a stab at it, but from a professional standpoint, we're kind of curious about what you would say the differences are between toxic and like a toxic relationship, or a toxic person, and actually crossing that line potentially into being abusive.
If the person is toxic, and that's a wide open term, then automatically a relationship with a toxic person will be toxic. I can't imagine it otherwise. And so, the first kinds of things that run across my mind is if you are in or were in a toxic relationship, what did you do to get out of it? And what have you done to be in charge of your own life, regardless of the pros and cons of the other person? People get divorced for a variety of reasons, including that they feel that their spouse is toxic, either as a person or the relationship. It's a matter of where you're looking, but the individual is toxic, the relationship is toxic. I can't imagine having a toxic relationship without there being some toxic people, one or both.
And what would you say the difference is between somebody who's toxic and abusive? Because they're not always the same, right?
Correct. There are some people who have anger management problems, but they are not inherently toxic. They just don't know how to have a measured response or how to check emotionally inside of themselves before taking any action, either verbally or physically, outwardly. I'd say there's probably more people who are abusive verbally than physically, but there's obviously a great overlay of abuse, both verbal and physical. So if you're in a relationship where you've got a bully, it just doesn't make any sense to stay in that kind of relationship. If you gave yourself an excuse, or I should say excuse the other person for one reason or another, after about the second time doing that, you should be seriously, very seriously taking a look at why are you still hanging around something that is that uncomfortable, unreasonable, negative, a hindrance to your emotional well-being, a hindrance to enjoyment. So, once you begin to look at yourself, then it really doesn't matter about the other person anymore. It's you're making choices based on your awareness of what recently has been going on, and obviously the history of it.
So not just looking at what the other person says or does, but looking intrinsically at yourself.
Right.
Makes sense.
Highfalutin words said the same thing.
What?
It was highfalutin words, but they say the same thing.
So what would be some red flags for any individual really to look for when it comes to a toxic relationship?
Right now, I'm going to press you for more. What do you mean by toxic relationship?
So let's say let's start with the person, since you were just talking about, let's start with the person who needs to look internally as to why maybe they're finding themselves in toxic relationships.
But you haven't defined a toxic relationship yet. That's where it starts, there's so many variables involved. You can't talk so broad and make sense out of it all. So you have to kind of get a little bit more detailed before you can choose what road you're going to go down to talk in more detail.
So, I mean, because I want to kind of I want to talk about maybe some of the things that could potentially lead to abuse or whatever, but some of those relationships where they're like, I'm trying to think honestly of just like where there's a lot of bickering, fighting, things that don't matter, person putting each other down. Those are all like, I think, pretty obvious signs. But is there something that you can see in like a personal or behavioral way, like a personality trait?
I'd be less inclined to look for a personality trait for either part of that relationship and more on the dynamics of it. What, it is when one person is putting down the other, is that in response to the other one already putting you down. There's also one person being more emotionally based and the other one is trying to stay intellectually in charge as opposed to just flailing around in emotions. Go ahead, you got the smirk on your face.
I think what you said kind of touched on when we're looking at like what we're defining as a toxic relationship. It's, again, it could be one or both people, but it's the dynamics of the relationship. I would say having a negative impact on the other person's state, emotional well-being, more so than positive. So it might be that, like Marie said, it's just a lot of fighting over nothing. It might be behaviors such as trying to make the other person jealous all the time. It might be avoidance. It might be intentionally causing the other person to stress out. So I think those are all go into what we're looking at as toxic, and maybe this subset of toxic that's different than, the level of like emotional or verbal abuse or something like that. So I think what Marie's trying to get to with red flags would be some of those things, and just kind of getting your take on that. So again, for me, I think it's, if someone is an inconsistent communicator, so 90% of the time, or let's say 40% of the time, whatever it is, they're answering your text pretty responsively. They'll pick up their phone when you call, and then all of a sudden for 3 days they go missing, or maybe not missing, but they disappear from communicating, and then they come back.
That's a 60 minutes or Dateline show.
Yeah, we're actually a true crime podcast now. But so some of the things I think of are inconsistency, and then intentionally trying to make the other person upset, or like you said, get back at them. Like, oh, you made me jealous, now I'm going to make you jealous, or things like that. I think those are all dynamics of what we're looking at as a toxic relationship.
Yeah, and I think I may have mentioned once in one of our other occasions when discussing relationships, where there was a relatively young couple who both had cheated on the other. And they were, a Bible page thin, ready to divorce. But they came to me. And actually, in about 6 sessions, they were fine. And the relationship was able to move forward as, a good thing for them. I don't remember what it was about in the details, none of that. But the point is that sometimes relationship can seem so, past being worth any effort, but you can get past that if you bother to look at your part and what you do that triggers the other person, and whether or not that's reasonable or not. And some things you have to pick your battles. We've covered that before. And if you don't pick your battles, then you're just a pain in the ass. And if you're a pain in the ass relentlessly, eventually the wall will crack, just like the Berlin Wall came down. They kept hitting it and hitting it and hitting it, and eventually it started to crack. And if you're constantly hitting this other person in an emotional way, in a behavioral way, without it having to be a physical thing, then eventually the relationship it won't survive if you continue to be the one who's jabbing at the other one. You have to take personal responsibility for what part you play in what's working or not working in the relationship. And if you find that your relationship is rocky, then you need to also try and find a soft way of inviting the other person to do the same thing, for them to look at their personal responsibility into it. So it's not like, well, I have to admit my fault before you can admit yours. You just, that's kid stuff. No, I'm going to wait until you just say you and your grandma wears army boots. So also keep in mind this. You may remember in one of our other occasions of discussions, I pointed out about trying to categorize, pigeonhole, causes problems in being able to see things for what they are and finding solutions for them. So the same applies here. A toxic relationship. It means different things to different people, and we're dancing around some of that right now. But forget the damn label. You have to talk about the dynamics. And so once you talk about the dynamics, some of it may fit what you think of as toxic, and in other cases, it's understandable, but you wouldn't exactly call it toxic. It's just a natural back and forth. If you keep accusing somebody, no matter what evidence or comments they make or other objective data, but the person's still accusing you of something, then you have to make ultimately a decision that you've tried all this, and if we can't come to a more cooperative relationship without hurting each other, then it makes more sense for us to separate and divorce. If there's a legal thing called marriage, a long-term relationship is just the same issues apply. So that's why I said earlier, it's the dynamics. So if you can't trust, there's really not much of anything that you can call a relationship, not substantively so. That start to answer your question?
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, yeah, for you, for your question. And it also kind of, you've given a few examples so far on some of those different dynamics. What would you say are some of the more common toxic dynamics that you've seen in your experiences?
People who are controlling, people who want to dominate, which controlling is a perfect match in there. Someone who is physically present, but they're not in the relationship in any usual sense of the term, such as severe alcoholics they don't do very well in relationships. They need to keep a distance. If one person in a relationship is a borderline personality disorder that I think I described at one point, they are like in a universe of a catch-22. They want a relationship, but it makes their skin crawl when they're in it. And so there's this back and forth, which drives the other person nuts. It infuriates them eventually, and then they can become physically abusive or even suicidally depressed because they don't have any control over what's happening. It's just doesn't make sense to them. And I've seen plenty of guys who they were really, depressed and suicidal, and it turns out that their wives were borderlines. And once they knew that, and like in many cases, I didn't see the wife, but I pieced it together and said, this is my guess, but I can't make that an official diagnosis. But if so, then here's what you can do and here's where you can't. If you want to go into therapy with a borderline, you can try it for a while, but it won't really likely go anywhere. A mild case of borderline, maybe that will work. But it takes typically a long time, and the increments of progression in improving is kind of small steps. So did I answer your question okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So, I mean, and borderline personality, it sounds like there's also some different like personal mental health things that can play into whether or not it's a toxic relationship, not just with borderline.
Right. Yeah, other people have their own separation issues and so forth that are not borderlines, but they share those commonalities of the things that don't work well in a relationship.
Makes sense.
Would you say that there are
I'm not advertising it.
oh, diet, yeah. So we're now sponsored by Diet Pepsi. So would you say that there are actual like identifiable differences between someone maybe just not being a good boyfriend or not being a good girlfriend versus being actively, whether intentionally or not, toxic? Like I can think of some examples, but in terms of, maybe where that line is, or maybe if we're looking at the relationship as a whole, where it goes from just being maybe not a good fit, not a good match to that kind of toxic state that we're thinking of.
Your question in there?
So the question as written is there a difference between a partner not necessarily being a good boyfriend or girlfriend and being actively toxic? So for example, what I think of with that question would be someone who's never been in a serious relationship before, or that's like a pretty big one, right? So they just like maybe they don't know what the expectations are. They don't know.
Even if you've been in a lot of relationships, the expectations are going to be different with different partners.
Sure. Yeah, sure. And I mean, that always comes down to communication, right? But that's where I think of, someone not being like a good boyfriend if they just don't have emotional maturity, one, or like relationship experience to have that foundation. And then of course, understanding what the expectations are for each individual relationship.
And that would frustrate the partner a whole lot. But typically, you're going to find one person who has not had that much experience in relationships, but if they're now in a relationship, they probably have hooked up with someone else that isn't too vastly different in things such as relationships. So they're both, when they're younger, going to be stumbling around more than later.
Yeah, I feel like a quote good or bad boyfriend is kind of a tough like that's very broad. It's like it's almost like the not the match thing. But um are there like the example that I think of with that question is like more aligned with jealousy. I think of jealousy a lot in terms of toxicity, either
And
as an individual person or like purposefully making the other person jealous.
jealousy is a red flag of insecurity.
Mm.
If you're jealous, you're insecure. Now you might think, a girl might say, well, that one girl's more attractive than I am, and so my significant other is just paying too much attention to that person. Uh, if ultimately the question is, can that be addressed by the partner? And the answer is yes. So, jealousy is one red flag, but again, like I've said other times as well as today, is that personal reflection, personal responsibility for whether or not you are contributing to the situation. So if you're insecure, then you're likely to misread whatever, misread how attractive the other person is, or does your significant other really is not paying much attention to this attractive individual that you think they are. But you have to look at yourself. And the more insecure a person is, the more problem they have looking at that.
So, what are some good questions a person could ask themselves if they're starting to feel jealous for whatever reason of something their significant other's doing?
It's not going to be, why am I jealous? Because they'll come up with any kind of excuses that they can possibly come up with.
Exactly.
It's going to be, what am I doing? What am I bringing to the relationship that is apparently not all that's needed for the relationship to sustain? And you can say, oh, well, but it's the other person who's out gallivanting and so forth. But what are you doing to kind of counter that without just, calling the other person names and, throwing dishes at them or whatever?
Now that's straight up abuse. So we can't ask ourselves why we are this way. What can we ask the other person? If say you're actively trying to make your boyfriend jealous for some reason and you're the boyfriend, what question should you ask to address that with your significant other?
Right. Try that one again with the
Yeah. So, all right, we'll just use say I'm in a relationship, I'm the girlfriend, I'm trying to make my boyfriend jealous. What questions can my boyfriend ask me to appropriately address the situation?
why do you think that I am not meeting your needs in the relationship? What is it that I need to address?
It seems like looking like versus just asking questions. on either side of it, understanding what the specific triggers are, or the specific scenarios also plays a role in it, right? So is it when we go to the beach, I'm jealous because, or like, for example, I don't know, like looking for specifics because it might trickle back to, oh, you find out that that person was cheated on in that situation or after one of those situations. Like, so for example, if it's, oh, they're, following a bunch of girls on Instagram and that bothers you. And maybe as the other partner, you don't understand why your partner is upset by that. You're just looking at photos. Is that a big deal? But if you can, again, have like open communication, maybe understanding that they had an ex who used to do that and maybe compare them to those people, or there were other just like different, like active, again, going back to like toxic behaviors around that. So I think it's looking not just at kind of like what do we ask, but what are the situations or the triggers? I mean, it might be everything, right? But I think sometimes there are some specifics that can track back. And if the partner understands that, then I think they can do a better job at, being respectful and mindful of that.
Right. Open communication, being willing to answer the hard questions to yourself and to the partner. And if you're not willing to do that, then you're not really willing to do the work of a relationship. Relationships are a pain in the ass. You can't really do without them. Now, there's many different kinds of relationships, but the relationship between you and the crossing guard is pretty insignificant.
Maybe.
Maybe. Striking up a relationship with your ex's friend would be more cumbersome.
Yeah, perhaps not ideal.
It's that willingness, because you value the relationship. There's something you want to be in the relationship, and you have to work at yourself as well as trying to find what avenues are open for the other person to open up, and also answer hard questions.
I feel like that's a good transition into this next question, which would be, so you see the red flags, you recognize that a relationship is toxic. Maybe you both end it, maybe one person ends it. But coming out of that, how do you move on? Not just in the sense of getting yourself back to like a healthy state of mind, but also ensuring that you're not entering into this cycle where you're then going to end up with someone that has the same behaviors, the same patterns, and just kind of continue that cycle.
Well, for some people, and I think women tend to be more inclined to do almost artsy, craftsy stuff in mapping out. You can make a list. You can make some kind of diagram. This is the relationship that I left. Here's what was working. Here's what wasn't. This was the progression of going to the negative point that we split up. And what is there and what is not there in this new relationship? Or if you're not in a relationship, you're just wanting to just clear your head from the relationship you left. And different people, you're back to depression and the stuff we talked about there. Self-soothing, not with alcohol, but you get involved in hobbies of one kind or another Some people might take up ballroom dancing or ballet dancing or a variety of things like that. It might be photography. It might be playing some kind of tabletop games with some other friends. And you are engaged in living life as opposed to kind of be mentally inside a jail cell, and you just go into a whole loop and you stay stuck on what didn't work, what didn't work, what didn't work. Oh, I feel bad. It didn't work. And that just goes nowhere and beats yourself up in the process. And so you spoiled your own life that way. You could be enjoying yourself.
And so then when it's time to date again, now you're like going through all of that. How can you, is there any way that you can ensure that you don't bring those experiences back into the new relationship in a negative way?
I would say some safety measures would be you take things slower and you ask yourself a lot of questions. Why am I attracted to this person? Was it the smile? Was it the sense of humor? Was it the physical appearance of them? Is it their education? Is it that you think that they're smart in some way that is very enticing for you? It might be, what kind of hobbies the other person has or what they do with their time when they're not at work. For some people, they help out at school events for the local school system. For some other people, it might be a church thing. It might be any number of variabilities. You got to have a life, and you want to make sure that you're taking a look at what drew you in the old relationship and what is drawing you now, instead of just, oh, it feels good. Well, yeah, we all like that part, but you're asking about what are you doing to make sure that you're not repeating an old pattern. So you have to slow down so that you can examine the various elements, what's attracting you. And then once you start to know some of those things that attract you, then you should also switch to what are some things that might crop up that would be on the negative side. And so this way, you're in a more mature way, you're not just emotionally reacting. Some people spark right there at the first meeting, and some other people that slowly grows. But when you start to feel that there's something there that you could call a relationship, then you look at the various elements. No one is perfect, so no one's going to be, all good, all great, and have all the characteristics that in your fantasies you want. It's taking stock of yourself in reality.
Sense.
And then you go out and get drunk.
Once you get your hobbies, then you do it. You got to get the hobbies first.
It seems like a piece of that too would be being aware of your reactions or behaviors that are triggered by those toxic reactions, those behaviors. So like, for example, if you're not generally a jealous person, and then you find yourself feeling that more often, or you're not generally an anxious person and you find yourself feeling that more often when it relates to that person. If, maybe even like you'd mentioned, if you're not a big drinker and you don't go out, but you find that when you're dealing with certain behaviors, you then start drinking a lot more. I think being aware of your own reactions and like behaviors is also a key piece of seeing when it's coming. Because sometimes, you know, you're blinded by how hot the guy is or the girl, or they're, you know, really charismatic or something. So you can get kind of pulled into.
Is that your pet dragon?
Yeah, that was my pet dragon. You can get kind of pulled into something, but I think being a little self-aware too as to like what kind of reactions or behaviors are triggered by those things can help you to identify it, as well as looking at the other person.
Sure. Now, for instance, some women, for guys too, but I think it's more because of stereotypes and so forth. We can probably see it more quickly, talking about a woman who has been in a relationship with a guy, and that didn't work out. And whether it was abusive, toxic, or whatever else, she might find out that she may be attracted to some other guy once the old relationship is over. But she can't go anywhere in forming a relationship because she doesn't trust guys. She's made a broad stroke safety device: don't trust men. Well, not all men had offended her. So for her to then not trust men, that's half of the population of the earth. So you have to narrow that down. So that's one example. It might be somebody, I'm not coming up with I'm not coming up with an example at the moment, but you get the idea here that people can become defensive and distant in how far they will go to form a relationship, or may even just resort to one-night stands every once in a while because they don't feel they can trust a relationship, the other person to be in one. So they just, they shut doors emotionally, and a good part of the time they're not even aware of it. So then that's a protective measure, but that leaves you alone. Mm-hmm. And then you're then lonely, and then you get depressed about that.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense.
Michelle, did you have any other questions before we wrap?
No, I feel like that definitely covered what I was thinking with this, and we covered just kind of some different areas of toxic and definitely some ways to move past it. And I think it'd be interesting for us to kind of poll or ask people or get more personal stories about how people have overcome that and worked through that. I mean, I would imagine for most people it's therapy. I think for some people it can also be life stage too. Like for me, I've never been in a like official toxic relationship, but I have been in situations where I was seeing people, and it, some of it was like being young and insecure, that I was, accepting of that treatment, or I was like, oh, this is fine. But getting older, going through life more, right? You learn as that happens. So I think that's some of it as well. But no, this was great. I feel like this is like the perfect follow-up to the episode we did with Mike, and gives us some real answers and gives some good advice to our listeners.
As fun as that episode was, I don't think we really had the insight that Marc does.
Perfect.
So
you covered this topic with someone else? Should I be jealous?
It was a little bit, yeah, we're trying to make you jealous. No, we did. We were just kind of talking about it, and honestly, like more or less shooting the shit. Kind of more like personal experience based, and not so much like best practices. Mm-hmm. So yeah, definitely appreciate you joining us again, Mark. We will
Sure.
let you go back to your evening, but it's always great having you here for the real shit.
Okay. Real shit, no shit.
Awesome.
People find us.
Swipe N the city across platforms.
Hmm? Say
Oh,
that.
swipe and the city everywhere.